should give some context to the Strata Jumpstart event. This is a new thing we're doing in New York, and the basic idea is to take a look at many aspects of running a business, from strategic to functional, and how in a data society the game has changed. That leads us on very nicely to our next speaker, Catherine Dekas from Google. Catherine's worked with the People Analytics Group in Google since May 2008, and she's currently the project manager for Google Geist, which is Google's annual employee survey. And she also leads basically the project to create the onboarding experience for new Google hires. So she's here to tell us about how Google make people decisions with data. Thanks very much, Catherine.
Thank you. I think our introduction from Michael is a really good segue into the kinds of things that Google does with data internally, even if we maybe appear like a lobster and don't share as much externally. But I'm really excited to be here today. I'm even more looking forward to seeing everyone in person in New York in September, so thank you. But we'll move now from talking about controlling and protecting data into kind of a specific use for how to use data within a company. And today and in September, I'm going to shed some light on how we use data here at Google to make people decisions in particular and influence action. So specifically, how to make use of data within the HR function. So as was just mentioned, I work in a group called People Analytics here at Google. It is the data and research arm of our HR department, which we refer to as people operations, which kind of cues you right away that people here really appreciate the data component of all of our functions. So rather than just calling it HR, we give it a name that's very similar to all of our other functions related to the operations of how we deal with people. So today what I'll do is share an overview of my group at Google, what we do, and I thought I'd go into detail about one example of how we've used data to drive decision-making and action. During the conference in September, I'll go into a little more depth about the specific framework and processes that we use to approach problems, engage with them, determine which data and analyses are most appropriate to apply to each one, and then how we use it to drive decisions. But today I thought it'd be hopefully interesting for you to hear a little bit about one project in particular. So first, before we dig into this project that we did, I thought it'd be helpful to have some context about Google as a company, because there are certain things that are inherent to our culture and our history that have helped shape where we are today and how we're able to use data in this way. So as of today, we have about 24,000 Googlers. This is what we call our employees here, in more than 60 offices around the world. We're turning into a bigger company, but as you probably know, we started out as a very small tech startup founded by 2 engineers. And as we all know, engineers value data. So as such, one of our core tenets of the culture from the very beginning across functions was that we would be very data-driven. And so to shape and influence action here from the beginning, you really have to speak the language of data. That's the bottom line. That's how the company grew, and that's what will help you make an impact. So along with that, there's a healthy appreciation here for being unconventional when it's useful to be. You know, we don't do things the way they've always been done just because they've always been done that way. So even in 2004, when we IPO'd, the letter from the founders started off by saying, you know, Google is not a conventional company, and we do not intend to become one. So in combination, kind of taking this really strong appreciation for data and kind of appreciation for being unconventional, these 2 things really pushed the development of our HR function in a way that was sort of different from how a lot of other HR functions evolved over time. So historically, many companies haven't necessarily relied on data to the full extent when making people or HR-related decisions. At Google at the beginning, it wasn't a question of adding data to HR. It was more of an expectation that HR would be done with data, just as every other area of the company used data. And so it was really how we grew up. It wasn't something that we integrated later. And I mention that because I think it's one of the the key differentiators, perhaps, it's an assumption that we will do this and an expectation. So in terms of how this is done, as I mentioned before, I'm part of a group called People Analytics, and it's a distinct group within HR. And our mission, we always say, is to ensure all people decisions at Google are based on data and analysis. We're composed of 3 types of people. We have some folks who have PhDs in organizational behavior or psychology. We have MBAs with a strong focus on quantitative stuff, but particularly in the human capital or HR arena. And then we have a group of people who are really strong experts in data mining and different kinds of analyses that will help with that. So that's kind of what our group looks like. In terms of what we mean by people decisions, this could range from hiring to talent management to benefits, compensation, any of the main kind of functions within HR. We try to apply as much data and thought as possible to. So in terms of how seriously we really take this, this isn't just part of the fabric of our culture, but it's also built into the structure of the HR department. And so we use what's kind of like a hub and spoke model where Laszlo Bock, our head of HR, is the middle and the hub, and then all of the major HR functions report to him, including analytics. And so that kind of indicates to us that it's a big area of focus. Often the analytics groups within HR will report up through other areas, so through staffing or through benefits, through something else. And here it's taken so seriously that we report directly into the VP of HR. We also have one person on our team who's directly the point of contact for each of those other functions within HR. So for example, talent management, benefits, staffing, et cetera. One person on our team is specifically dedicated to each of those areas and really intimately knows the data available to them and also the goals and the interests and the challenges of each of those areas. So they're able to kind of bring together the data and the strategy and the challenges to start to think about how the data could be used to shed light on or influence the kinds of things we're trying to work on. So that's just a quick overview of kind of who we are. And what I thought I would do now is talk a little bit about Project Oxygen, which some of you may have heard about. It was actually profiled in the New York Times earlier this year. And in September, like I said, I'll walk more through the framework that we use to develop all of these kinds of projects. But for now, just thought I would dive a little deeper into this one. So if you're interested, you can actually look up this, the write-up in the New York Times. It was related to Google's people managers. So giving a little bit of history and going back to our engineering culture, one of the kind of unusual problems that we were facing a couple of years ago was that being a people manager here wasn't necessarily seen as a desirable position. So those of you who work in the technology industry, you know that what's really valued in tech companies is doing hardcore technical work. So being a people manager may not always be seen as aligning with that. So at Google several years ago, we actually did away with people managers in many parts of the organization as kind of a, hey, let's experiment with this. Do we really need managers? And as you can all imagine, this did not work out too well. And they brought the managers back, but the stigma of being a manager remained. And so there was this kind of anecdotal assumption that managers didn't matter. And so what our team did was we kind of undertook a study to understand if managers really did matter in any measurable way, and if so, how they did and how we could improve them. So at the beginning, we looked at the data that we had already. There are thousands of people managers at Google. We wondered, are they really that different? How can we quantify who's good, who's bad? And so we looked at two sources of data. One was Google Dice, which is our annual survey, and the other was scores on managers' performance reviews. And, those of you who are working in companies now will know that these aren't really particularly unique data sources. many or even most companies probably have an annual employee survey and probably rate employees' performance. And so this is something that, many companies could do. And we chose these because we wanted to get two signals on managers. We wanted to get a bottom-up view from their direct reports, and we got that through Google Geist, their annual survey, which asks employees to rate their managers. And we wanted to get a top-down signal as well from managers to get a perspective on the impact that managers had. So we plotted these two data sources against each other, and at first blush, it looked like managers were doing pretty similarly. There was kind of a big, tightly clustered group of people who had seemingly similar scores on these two measurement sources. So what we did then was we parsed people out into the top and bottom quartiles to look at the differential impact, if any, that people who were doing exceptionally well versus those who were really struggling, the differences between the impact that they had on their teams. And it was really astounding. So we used regression analysis to look at this influence. And what we found is that the top scoring managers, so kind of our best managers, had happier employees, they were less likely to leave, they were more productive, all kind of the big outcome variables that you look for. We also looked at employees who had moved from good to bad managers or bad to good to get some insight into the causality here, and the results held up. So this was pretty interesting to us. We kind of had this academic exercise that showed us that, okay, managers appear to matter, right? But although this was interesting insight, it didn't help us act on anything, right? We didn't know how the managers got to be good managers, or what the bad managers were maybe doing wrong, or what kind of situations they were in that were really giving them a challenge. And so the next step was to collect new data. And so at that point, we conducted a series of double-blind interviews. And so what we mean by that is that neither the interviewer nor the interviewee knew which category they were in, good or bad manager. And we used that information to identify what kinds of behaviors our best managers did compared to those of our worst, so to speak, or our managers who were really, struggling. And then what kinds of pitfalls the ones who were struggling with were facing systematically. So where we went from there is we coded the data using systematic qualitative coding methods, and we came up with the 8 behaviors that have been profiled in the paper on what makes a good manager. And I won't go into them all here, but you can see them if you Google them, or just a couple are, manager is a good coach, he or she empowers the team, doesn't micromanage, they express concern or interest in their team's well-being, and they show important technical skills that help them advise their team. So those are just a few. In terms of pitfalls, we found that some of the situations that were the toughest were when a manager had a really tough transition. So they were suddenly promoted, they had to suddenly maybe manage people who used to be their peers. Perhaps they had a tough transition coming from outside Google, and then they had little training when they got here about the culture or how things work here. So tough transition was a really common one. Or another really consistent pitfall was the person lacked a consistent philosophy regarding performance management or career development. Or finally, a lot of people were just spending too little time on managing, and that was something that was pretty common. So these were the things that we found in terms of behaviors that were kind of common amongst our best managers, and then common amongst the ones who are really struggling. And what we did with that is try to then feed this information back into different programs to help our managers improve. So here's where we kind of moved from taking the data and understanding it into driving action. And so what we do now is we have a semi-annual upward feedback survey where the questions align directly with the behaviors that we know are, exemplary here. So we have all direct employees rate their managers on these 8 behaviors, plus an overall question about would they recommend their manager. And then that data is given to managers. And what we found is that even just having the information about how they're doing helps managers improve. But even taking that a step further, just talking about the transparency internally that Michael spoke of just in the past talk, we strongly encourage managers to share their scores and their reports with their teams and then discuss what's going well and how to keep improving. And so this culture of transparency does help us in a lot of areas here because managers are very much held accountable for their results on the surveys. So after assessing the managers through the surveys, we also annually award a Great Manager Award. And so we obviously want to recognize and reward the people who are doing these things very well and show how much we value the work that they're putting in. And so we use a Great Manager Award to do that. We also look at the Great Manager Award submissions to help us keep understanding what kinds of things people value in their managers to make sure that these 8 behaviors still capture the things that are indicative of a good manager here. After that, we've designed a lot of training courses around these 8 behaviors that help managers who are struggling in a particular area. So if you get your upward feedback scores and you're really struggling on, say, communication, you can look specifically for training courses that are aligned to that behavior and target that directly. So it's very helpful in terms of quickly kind of developing some new skills in an area where you know you're kind of maybe a little bit deficient. And then last, what we try to do is set regular expectations with managers. So using this information that we know to be true based on the data, we regularly send communications around, this is an opportunity to demonstrate XYZ behavior, which we know is important based on Project Oxygen. So we try to weave that into everything that we do. So that's kind of just a quick summary of one project that we've done based on data here. And during the conference in September, like I said, I'll walk through kind of the framework that we use to take on these kinds of projects and also give you a couple of other examples of ways that we've used data to drive action and make decisions here at Google. So hopefully that gives you a little taste. And if you have any questions, happy to answer them now, or also happy to respond to emails afterward if you'd like. My email address is my first initial and my last name, so kdekas@google.com.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think we have time for a couple of questions that have come up on the chat as you've been talking.
Sure.
The first one, Jason Davies is asking, do you fall foul of any kinds of anti-discrimination laws if you just blindly use sort of data mining? What's the interrelation between doing analytics and the law?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the short answer is that we work very, very closely with our lawyers all the time. We want to make sure, obviously, that we're in full compliance with any, not just discrimination, but any kinds of laws that might, relate to any of the analyses that we're doing. So, yes, they're fully involved. And I would definitely recommend, if you're thinking about creating an analytics function, to do so in conjunction with your legal department or whomever is, in charge of the diversity and inclusion functions in your organization.
That makes sense. A question from Michael Nelson, previous speaker. He's asking, why is it that Google outwardly shares so little information about employees? It's we talk about Google as a lobster. Sometimes it feels a bit like an octopus. There are many tentacles, but you're not quite sure whether they're all connected. And how is it, sometimes it's impossible from the outside to try and route to the right person.
Yeah. I wish I could give you a really solid, good answer about this. I actually personally am not involved in those decisions, and so I'm not sure. I will say that, of course, in a culture where knowledge is our business and intellectual property is, our bread and butter, we have to be pretty careful about the kinds of things that we're working on, and even just talking about, the team a person's working on or the project, it could shed light on kind of our business strategy. And so, I can't necessarily give you the total answer on that because I'm not involved, but that would be my hypothesis.
I have noticed since Google Plus was launched, that the team there has quite a different strategy. Everyone, all the people working on different features have been pretty upfront and personally available, and the data liberation front group also has that similar kind of strategy. So it seems that it might be applied where it's useful to apply it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've got just one more question here. We didn't really talk on the hiring process, but could you, in a couple of sentences or so, maybe summarize how data is used when you're selecting candidates?
Sure. So I would say that data is used absolutely throughout. It's almost impossible to touch on all of the ways that it's used. I mean, from all the way to, from figuring out how many interviews a person should go through based on what we've found to be the optimal number to predict kind of performance later on, all the way through to, interview scores. We try to use data as much as we possibly can to give insight into, how well a candidate, stacks up against others. So I think if somebody has a specific question about how data is used in hiring, I'd, recommend you send me an email afterward, and I'd be happy to talk offline or direct you to the people who work really intimately with that.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate you sharing candidly with us, and really looking forward as well to hearing you talk on the Monday. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So before we move on, I'm just going to give a brief overview, and I'll keep this short because there's so many interesting speakers to hear of what's going on in Strata, New York. We're actually taking a whole week in New York to cover really the whole of the area of data in business and society and tech. On the Monday, the Jumpstart, of which you've heard two speakers already, is really looking at kind of a remedial data MBA. Where does data fit into the various parts of running a business? And on the 20th and 21st, we have Strata Summit, which is much more of a high-level strategic look at how data is changing industries, it's changing government, it's changing science, it's changing world politics. And we have speakers including Stephen Wolfram, Paul DePodesta, who was he currently works for the New York Mets, so he was the numbers guy behind Moneyball. So there's a great example there of how data changed sport, and I think there are lots of lessons he can share that might be relevant to those of us who are just getting into data now. Matthew Bishop, who's the U.S. business editor of The Economist, is also going to speak. He has a fantastic thesis about the fact that we're probably measuring the wrong things economically speaking. Our macroeconomic indicators date from just after the Depression, and with the amount of data and crunching we can have access to now, are there better indicators we can use to manage our economy? And also we'll have 5 startups that have just been selected from a larger group of entrants who will be pitching during the Wednesday and will be judged on stage and the winner selected. And then on the Thursday and Friday, 22nd and 23rd, we have Strata Conference, which is a real practitioner hands-on event with multiple tracks covering business, data science, UI interfaces, case studies, some more great keynotes there. So I hope as many of you can join us as possible. If you go to strataconf.com, you can register. And in the chat, I think Catherine posted a discount for everybody who's turned up to this session. So thanks very much. Just a couple of competitions to talk about, actually, that are pretty relevant to our next speaker. A couple of companies are working with us to run visualization contests for DataSet. So this slide here is talking about the one that we've done in conjunction with Tableau. So I recommend you go to the website link there to check out more of the entrants. And also with Juice Analytics, we're running a contest we're calling the Strata Visathlon, which, given food and nutritional data, something dear to all our hearts, what can you visualize to really explore deeper this relationship and tell a story? Very happy to have Nathan Yao of the Flowing Data blog, which if you haven't read it, you absolutely should, among the judges there on that competition.